Hi, my name is Joseph Griffiths, and I'm going to give you a quick overview of learning vRealize Orchestrator as an introduction into Orchestrator and how to interact with it. There's contact information on the page. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. The first thing when working with Orchestrator is you needed to deploy the appliance or vRealize automation that includes Orchestrator. Once that's been deployed, you'll be able to navigate to the web page for the appliance by going to its URL as shown above. Once you've gone to this URL, you'll see a number of things on the screen. One of the most important ones is the Start Orchestrator client. So we're going to go ahead and run that right now. And I'll download the JNLP, which I require Java to run, and go ahead and start running it. As we start it, it will come up with a number of windows asking us if we want to continue and whether we trust this website. In this case, I know that it's my own Orchestrator instance, so I do trust it, so I'm going to continue. And we'll go ahead and choose to run it. It's from VMware, and it'll come up with a login. In my case, I'm using default credentials to log in. Alright, once we log in, we'll be shown this particular window, which shows that we're logged in. We've got a number of different things across the top. One of the first things you need to understand about Orchestrator is there's three different modes. There's Run, there's Design, and Administer. For most of what you're doing, you're going to be working inside of Design, so we're going to switch to Design. You'll notice that when you switch to Design that the icons across the top change. We have workflows, we have actions, we have resources, configurations, packages, and inventory. One of the first things to understand is that Orchestrator's job really is to interact with a bunch of different endpoints and communicate with them and orchestrate different actions between them. I'll give you an example here. If you click over here on inventory, you'll see a number of different endpoints that are capable, and through plugins you can add additional endpoints. Here we have PowerShell endpoints that we could use, we have vRealize automation endpoints we have VMware API, which I've actually got one configured here for my vCenter right there. We have SOAP endpoints, none of those have been configured. VRO configurations, SSH, so we could log into Linux and Unix boxes and do configuration there. We have a plugin for vCenter, which I do have configured here, and you can see that I've got a vCenter configured, and it actually pulls in information on it. We also have REST API stuff, and you'll see here that I've configured my vCenter as a REST API endpoint as well. And we have things like SQL plugins. Many vendors produce additional plugins that you can use to connect to endpoints. And this is really the power of Orchestrator, is the ability to connect to all these different endpoints. Once we've connected to an endpoint, the real power comes from what we call workflows. Workflows are sections of steps that have programmatic logic in order to complete different actions. For example, let me show you one here where I'm doing the configuration. If I was to add a new vCenter, I would run this particular workflow, and as I click on a workflow, you'll see that there's a lot of different tabs across the top. We're going to take a look at the schema, which actually shows us the workflow running. And on this workflow, we have a start, which is the green arrow here. We have a successful completion, which is the target at the end. And we have a number of places where we can run errors if something goes bad in our process. And then in the middle, we have a number of different things that are doing different tasks as part of this. In the past, I've run this, and I ran it. As you can see, I can expand this and show the successful runs. Green check mark means successful. We got to a successful target, and I can go back and look in here and see that we completed successfully. When I ran it, the statements that were inside of the variables, so I was connecting to this particular vCenter, as it's denoted right there, with all of these variables, and you can see any logging of information that was done. I can also right-click on this and run it again with the same parameters. For example, here you'll see I select Run Again, and it came up with a new window, and it came up with the previous parameters I had in there. In case I had an error, I can go modify them. Now, I'm not going to run it again because I've already registered this, but this is how you would add a vCenter to your brand new Orchestrator instances, by running this particular workflow. After that, then all of the API stuff for vCenter would be available. And as we go through workflows, you'll understand how complex they can be and how simple they can be. Some workflows are extremely complex, others are very simple. For example, here you see a workflow where I have a start and I have a finish, and in between I have what we call as an action. An action is a piece of JavaScript code that we've written that takes an input and produces an output for us. Think of it like a programmatic function. They're very reusable, and they're stored under this Actions tab up here. I'll click on that real quickly, and you can see there's a number of actions that have been provided by VMware. And down at the bottom, I've created my own folder, and I'm going to go ahead and expand that. And you'll see the one that we were just looking at right there. And this has a general tab, which allows us to have versioning, signatures, tags, descriptions. It has a scripting tab, which tells us what kind of return this is going to return. So this particular action is going to return an array of an object called VC virtual machine. And down here you see the actual code where we're going to run some tasks. You can see the events that have happened to it and permissions if I want to lock specific people to only be able to use it, modify it, change it, or delete it. When we look at resources, these are specific files that have been uploaded. They can have all kinds of data in them. For example, this sysprep.inf file, well, it can't be shown, but is a text file that has some information on sysprepping when you're doing a provisioning of new virtual machines, specifically Windows virtual machines. So within here, you're able to create new folders, move folders around, and then import resources, which is essentially upload a text file or some sort of data file. This is when you need to have some sort of configuration file that is independent of your action, and then you can bring these resources into your workflows. Another good use of resources is anytime where you need to have something formatted a specific way and you're struggling with the formatting. We have configurations. This allows us to create attributes that are going to be shared across multiple workflows. Think of them as a form of global variable that is unique to this particular instance. So we can reference the configurations and go back and pull those into our scripts. So if I have a development orchestrator and a production orchestrator, I could choose to have the configuration in my development one pointing to development endpoints and the one in my production pointing to the production, and my workflow would only need to call the configuration variable named endpoint or whatever I need to call it here. So for example, I can create one. We're going to create a new element here. It's asking me to name it. I'm going to call it test. I did that by right-clicking. And it's going to ask me for the name and some attributes, and then it's going to give me the opportunity to give attributes. And so we're going to call this particular attribute, and I got this window up by clicking the name at. We're going to call this environment, and we'll give it a value of development. Or perhaps I would give it the environment of a development endpoint server IP address. So save that. Now we can pull this test and all of its attributes into our workflows and have that feed in without and have them unique per orchestrator environment if I need to. Here we have packages. These are things that have been imported to provide various features, functionality. You'll see in here there's all the various endpoints that I talked about. For example, the SNMP, the SOAP, the SQL, the SSH, the vAPI or the vCenter. And you'll be able to import additional packages by right-clicking. You can import them from a folder, you can get remote packages, or you can create your own packages. And then endpoint we've already talked about. So based on this, I want to quickly go through and talk about a basic workflow. And we're going to create a new one inside of my folder here called New Workflow, and it will give us this dialog that asks for the name for the workflow. Now the name does not have to be unique. It uses an internal GUID ID to be able to reference the various workflows, so the name can be the same as any other name. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and call it Test2. And once I've created that, it opens up the workflow window. In here, I have a general tab. This allows us to insert one of our three types of variables, known as attributes. Attributes are global variables to the workflow. They do not exist outside the workflow, but they exist within the workflow and can be modified by the workflow. So I'm going to create a attribute called, and I got that up by clicking the name again. I get one called environment. There we go. And I can choose the type, which is the variable type, and I click the name string to get this, and you can see there's lots of built-in types. For example, earlier I mentioned the VC virtual machine type is here. In this case, I want to create a string. And I could do an array or a single string. So we're going to do this as a string. Now I can tie this to a configuration variable. Remember how I did that earlier by clicking this button right here. When I click that, that brings up all my configuration variables. Remember, I named one called test, and I had one called environment string, and I chose that existing and selected it. And now the value of this will come in through that configuration variable we just created. We have inputs. These are things that as the workflow begins are expected for the user to provide or something to provide into the workflow in order to operate. So I've added one by clicking that button, Add Parameter here. And I'm going to click the name of it to change its name. And I'm going to choose to use the word color. And at the time, I'm going to leave it this description blank. I'm going to leave it as a string. Outputs are things that come out of workflows and can be handed off to other things. This is how workflows can be sub-elements of other workflows and be handed off. I'm not going to create any outputs at this time, but you would do it by adding a parameter here. Inside the Schema tab, you can see what I've shown you before. All blank workflows start out with a start and a finish successfully. If I was to run this workflow with nothing else, it would successfully run, except it's going to ask me for the parameter of color that I created earlier. It's going to do absolutely nothing with it, but it's going to ask for it because in the inputs I said that I want to know color. And as you can see, it's now run, it's running, and it went green and is successfully completed. In there I can see that environment has been brought in and the value has been pulled in, and color, the string, has come in because that's what I provided, and there's nothing in the logs. Inherently, this does very little of nothing. It's not very helpful at all. Over here on our left, we have a number of different things that have been provided by VMware to give us elements and actions. The most commonly used one is a scriptable task. Now remember, everything is unique to its own environment. So I'm going to drag by selecting scriptable task and put it over here. And this is going to be a snippet of JavaScript code. And I can edit the scriptable task, and that will open the scriptable task window. Anything I do inside of this window is automatically saved to the scriptable task, but I don't truly save it until I click Save or Save as Closed down here at the bottom. So for example, I'm going to click now Save. It's going to go ahead and save it, which it did. It said there's an error in validation, but it has been saved. So I click on my scriptable task again and the Edit tab, and here I have information. I can give it a description, I can give it next elements, what it does next. So next I'm telling it to end workflow. I could choose to throw an error in end or whatever else in there. So that's how that works. When we go to input, these are things that come into the scriptable task. Now I can click this little button to bind things that exist. So outside of the scriptable task, I have an input of color and I have an attribute of environment that comes from the configuration parameter I provided before. I'm going to ask that both of these be passed into the scriptable task. If I don't, then they're not available as variables inside the scriptable task. Now notice I don't have anything coming out of this scriptable task, but because a attribute is a global variable, in this case environment, I can change that and it will persist. But otherwise I would need to have an output parameter that goes out. I can click my visual binding to see how my input parameters from my greater workflow are being brought into this specific scriptable task, as you can see. And I can also drag and drop or delete these or recreate them like this, drag and drop. See how I click the red X to remove and I just drag and drop to put it on there. And then I get to the important part, which is scripting. Now for the sake of this, I understand that I have two input parameters. I have color and environment that are listed up here. I also have over here a number of actions that I can do based on all the libraries and content that I've loaded in there. For this, I'm going to do a very simple one, and I'm just going to log what is inside of color and inside of environment. And I'm going to use system.log, and you want to be a little bit careful because JavaScript is case sensitive. And you can see that the integrated editor is automatically telling me that there's an unexpected end because I haven't ended with a semicolon and I'm in the middle of a thing, of a line. So I'm going to write color equals, and then I'm going to use the plus symbol and color. Notice that it changed to purple on the word color because it knows that it is a variable that exists inside of this workflow. And I'm going to go to plus symbol and say environment equals plus symbol environment, end of my logging, and then semicolon to end my text. Now notice it's still complaining because it takes a minute to catch up, and once it catches up, it knows that that's properly formatted JavaScript. I'm going to go ahead and close my sub window, and I'm going to run this workflow that I've just created. Once again, it's going to ask me for my input parameter, and out of ease of testing, it knows that I input red previously, so it'll keep letting me put that in unless I want to change it. I'm going to change it a little, and I'm going to go ahead and submit it. We're going to wait a minute while it runs, and you can see that it's successfully completed. And the output from my logging to system log was color equals red and environment equals that data. So now we've got a very basic thing that's going to pull in environments and attributes. By default, this isn't particularly useful. It doesn't actually do anything in my environment. Now when I go to save and close, it's going to ask me if I would like to increase the version of my versioning on this, because I've made changes. And I'm going to go ahead and increase my version. And now as you can see, I'm back out at test 2, and it sees that I've run it twice, and it gives me the log entry, so I can go back and do a lot of diagnosis on what went wrong if it failed. I can also run it from here. Immediately it asks me the same question. Doesn't remember my previous entry. In fact, I'm going to go with a different entry this time. And I'm going to go ahead and submit it for the last test, and as you can see, it's successfully completed, and my environment is now my color is now green, and my environment is the same. If I go back to my variables here, edit them, and change my environment to be something else. As you can see here, I just changed it. Now I'm going to go ahead and run it, and it asks for my color again, which I'm going to choose to give it no answer to. As you can see, color equals nothing, environment equals what I just changed the configuration variable. So we see that there's a lot of value in the ability to pass this stuff through, and understanding how the configuration variables and attributes all work together is very important. And to that point, I'm going to go ahead and show you how to modify the attribute. So we know that right now environment is set to that. We want to reassign environment to something else. So we're going to give it to 55.55 here. I'm going to go ahead and change environment to an output parameter. Environment is now being passed out of this, and let's go ahead and run it and see if it actually changes the information. It will ask for color, we'll pass it out, and you will see that it once stated that it was the right number, and now it's changed it to 55.55. As you can see, that allows us to do it, but we've got to select outputs and correctly build our visual binding. It knows that the attribute exists, so we can tie it out to that. So once again, this doesn't give you a particularly beneficial tool to use. It just helps you understand how this works. So from here, I'd like to do a quick one to be able to list all the virtual machine names. Something that's pretty easy to duplicate. So we're going to create a new workflow where we call list all VMs. Notice it'll be similar to others. We're going to do this via scriptable tasks like we've done in the past. It's not going to take any inputs. We're going to edit the scriptable task and go to scripting, and we're going to insert the right script. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a comment. I'm a big fan of commenting my code. You can use // to do that, so that's a comment, and it's highlighted in gray because it's ignored by the system. And then we're going to create a variable that will hold the output of all of our virtual machines. In order to do that, we're going to use the API to locate something that will produce all virtual machines. So I'm going to search for all VMs. From that, I identify that there is a number of methods that are built into the API. As you can see, I'm going to make that more readable, that will provide this. And one of the fun things about Orchestrator is it can go across multiple vCenters. Notice that I can get all the VMs of a cluster, or all the VMs of a data store, or I can just get all the virtual machines. And if I select the one that I'm looking for, in this case I want all virtual machines, and I select Go to Selection, that will provide me, after I exit this window, with additional information. So this is the method, get all VMs. It returns all the virtual machines. It has no parameters that it takes in, and it returns, and this is important, a type, which is array of VC virtual machine, or returns all virtual machines. If you'd like to understand more about VC virtual machine, you can click on it, which we'll do in a minute. But take a look at this first. We know, number one, that this is the library, and this is the method on that particular library to return this array. So I'm going to create a variable, VMS, which will hold an array of VC virtual machine. And then I'm going to run system.getModule, if I can spell it correctly. And then I'm going to take the name that is above, see how that was, this is directly taken from here. Do you see it? Right there, that's important. And then I'm going to run the method. And remember, this is case sensitive, so it's very important that you follow the exact case as the name has. If you don't, you're not going to get the right thing. So now I'm going to assign to this variable an array of these. Now, if you're interested in what is VC virtual machine, you can click on that, and it'll bring back information on it. And we'll scroll to the top. VC virtual machine is this object, and it has the following properties: VM type, memory, VM ID, which is the internal VMware or vCenter ID, name, CPU, and many other things. So you'll see a number of different things that are important to you that you can pull out as data points on this. Now, each of these might actually produce arrays of themselves. Some of them may be single entries, some of them may be arrays, so you have to be a little bit careful in understanding that. So I'm going to go ahead and close this. I'm going to run it to ensure that it works, and I typed everything correctly. And if it works, I expect nothing to come back. It completely ran, no variables, no log, because it's doing nothing other than assigning it to this VMFS or VMS. And remember, VMS is not being exported outside of this scriptable task because I haven't done it as an out, so it doesn't exist after the scriptable task runs. In this case, I'd like to take all the virtual machines that are on my system, and I would like to output their names into a new array. So I'm going to go ahead and create an array to hold the virtual machine names. As you can see right here, I created it using the var VM name and then define that as a new array. And then I'm going to use a for loop to loop through, and we're going to output the names of the virtual machines to system log, and we're going to push it onto the array. We'll do that with a for each loop. This is very much like PowerShell, those that are familiar. For each VM in VMFS, so that's for each VC virtual machine object inside of the many virtual machine VC objects. And we'll create our brackets so that we have proper coding for our for each loop. And what we are going to do is we're going to system.log the vm.name. And for the sake of interest, let's go ahead and put a space in there, and we will go ahead and log also vm.id. Notice how that's listed right here as an object that exists inside of that, or an entity. Then we're going to go ahead and do the system.logout and execute it. And for the sake of what we're doing, we're going to take the array that we just created, our VM name. We're going to push the entity of vm.name into that, and then we're going to execute it. Now let's go ahead and run this. This should give us an output to our logging that provides some information from my environment. It's run successfully. We have variables. There's none because we haven't outputted any, but in log we have a VRO VM that's known by vCenter or its vCenter as VM19. Notice that's unique per vCenter and so on. So that worked the way we wanted it. Now I can take that, and for the sake of interest, I would like to use another loop to loop through the array and see what the contents of that array are to make sure that I inserted everything correctly. So I am going to run through the array, and we're going to assign I to be equal to 0, and then we're going to say as long as I is less than the VM name.length, I would like you to increment I each run through of this. We'll go ahead and open the bracket, close the bracket, and what I want you to do is I want you to system.log. Remember, the case sensitivity is critical here. And we are going to do array VM name. So here we're just going to log out the position. So I will start out with 0 and go through whatever number of virtual machines I have and the name. And we'll run this real quick to see how it outputs. As you can see, we did our original logging and then we did the new one. Has position 0, has VRO to match our first one, and so on through it. And now we've created a scriptable task that's able to go through all of these things. Now again, this isn't terribly useful. As you start to explore the basics of this, for example, if you were looking for data stores, you could easily go out and use the plugin to get all data stores, or you could do other things with data stores that you're interested in. Let me see, find one here. That's a attribute, so we want to get all data stores. So we're going to go ahead and go to that selection and close. In here, we have a method under a whole bunch of stuff here under this particular SDK connection, which is called a different way. And it produces an array of VC data store. If we click into that, this is, and we can expand it right here. These are all the things that are available on VC data store. Now notice here's interesting. Here, these are fields that are available to give you data like what host it's on and things like that. But more interesting down here, there are some methods. So we can add a tag to that data store. We can destroy the data store. We can do a bunch of stuff to the data store. And we would have to have the specific data store identified, and then we could do that work against it. So this is a basic overview of vRealize Orchestrator and how to interact with it. From here, you can take a lot of things and use scriptable tasks, and you can create more complex things. I'll give you an example. We'll go over to the storage management, and we'll take a look at a data store here. There's a lot more complexity going on here. Or, for example, our data store files and management, if we want to delete all files, you'll see that these are far more complex with lots of different logic built in. And this is the power of Orchestrator, is that you can orchestrate and build workflows for a lot of different things with a lot of different value. I hope this has been helpful to you. Feel free to reach out to me via Twitter or my email if you have any questions, and good luck with VRO.